Perception collapse in narcissistic abuse. Why your perception betrayed you and how to reclaim it. There is a moment, not always visible from the outside, when your perception becomes the very thing that begins to fail you. Not because we were weak or naive or broken, but because we were hijacked. The moment we were idealized, our perceptual field stopped being ours. And when it stopped being ours, we stopped trusting it, even though we didn't know it yet. This is the silent beginning of collapse. We don't talk enough about the collapse of perception, but it's the first fracture in the architecture of the self. Because the moment you're pulled into an idealizing gaze from a narcissistic partner, family member, or system, your nervous system doesn't register affect, it registers approval. It mistakes intensity for intimacy, certainty for truth, charm for safety. It confuses familiarity with love. This is not a conscious choice. It's a work of the anticipatory stress reflex, the evolved adult form of our early attachment reflex. It scans the relational field for danger or approval. In childhood, if attunement was partial, intermittent, or conditional, your perception evolved not to see clearly, but to survive socially. So by the time you met them, your perceptual field was already pre-wired to misread threat as hope. And that's not your fault, but it does mean you must stop trusting what you think you saw and start rebuilding what you now feel. Idealization destroys objectivity. When someone idealizes you and you mistake it for love, it bypasses your defenses and enters your libidinal system, the emotional reward circuitry of your psyche. It does so through the organizing gate, the internal mechanism that governs symbolic meaning, safety, and emotional truth. In a healthy system, the organizing gate helps you distinguish between fantasy and reality. But in a collapsed system, especially one forged in childhood, the gate is porous. The idealization slips in. It merges with your unmet need. It triggers a feedback loop of craving, validation, performance, and projection. You start seeing yourself through their gaze. Your own becomes secondary, compromised, distorted. The false becomes real, the familiar becomes safe, and the predator becomes home. This is not seeing, this is mirroring. It is reflexive, mirrored psychic inversion, and it destroys the vertical axis of self perception. Why you can't trust what you thought was true. Survivors often ask, why didn't I see it sooner? How did I let this happen? How could I have been so blind? The answer is, you didn't let anything happen. It was designed to bypass your perception. Narcissistic systems don't just lie to you, they use your own perceptual architecture against you. They weaponize your gaze against your gut. You didn't ignore red flags. You were taught that flags don't matter. You didn't trust the wrong person. You were trained to trust whoever wanted you. You didn't betray yourself. You were betrayed by a system that trained you to betray yourself in exchange for temporary safety. The collapse of perception is the collapse of self. By the time you start to question reality, it's too late. You're not just confused, you're unreal. You're not just being betrayed, you're symbolically inverted. Your entire nervous system, memory field, symbolic world, and psychic center have collapsed inward. This is CIPR, collapse-induced psychotic regression. It is not psychosis in the clinical sense. It is a psychotic structure where the symbolic world and the real world blur. Where you feel insane, not because you are, but because your introjected relational field is fractured, split, mirrored, and contradictory. This is when survivors become afraid of their own minds, not because their minds are dangerous, but because they are now looping through perceptual fragments that no longer stabilize. Reclaiming the gaze. How to build perception post collapse. You cannot rebuild perception through analysis. You cannot rebuild perception through logic, journaling, or rationality alone, because the wound is symbolic, not intellectual. To rebuild perception, you must recognize the inversion, accept that your perception was trained to misfire, re enter the vertical axis, withdraw from expectation, fantasy, or performative interaction. Anchor in reality, not the narcissist, not your projection, but a moment of still truth, a glass of water, your breath, the sound of your own voice. Name the fracture, speak out loud. I do not trust my perception. I will now rebuild it by seeing the world slowly. Engage only with stabilizing eyes. Find a gaze that holds you, not breaks you, one that is present, not performative. This is grounding. This is symbolic reintegration. The grief of misperception. Eventually, the real grief begins. Not just grief for them, but grief for the version of you who believed it was real. This is sacred. It must not be bypassed. You will want to skip it and try to rebuild fast, but perception can only return once the ASR3, the anticipatory shadow reflex, is witnessed, calmed, and restructured. This shadow structure is what's formed in the absence of safety, and until you let it grieve, it will continue to protect you by clouding your perception. That's its job, but now it must be released. You're not broken. You were rewritten. Your perception didn't betray you. It was repurposed, co-opted by unmet need, inverted gaze, and fantasy-based projection. But it's not beyond repair. In MPIT, perception collapse is not the end. It is the opening, the crack through which the vertical self can re-emerge, the moment you begin to see not with their eyes, but with your own, and your own are finally adjusting to the light. Peace out. Loads of love.